Hey guys, so this is going to be part 2 of Apocalypse Soon. I'm going to be talking about the dress rehearsals of the Four Horsemen, basically. There's been a lot of events in history that have looked kind of like the things that are talked about in Revelation 6, as far as those first 4 seals being opened by Jesus in heaven. There's a lot of speculation as far as what those things might be, but it's pretty clear what they are based on what the Bible says about the seals when they're being opened. Right? I'm going to go through those. I was watching one of my own videos the other day, and I realized that I say a lot. I just think that it's one of those things where when I'm talking to a person face to face, if I want to think of the next right thing to say, I tend to pause and think of it before saying the next thing. But my wife is always telling me how that's really annoying. And so when I'm making these videos for you guys, I tend to put in more of those filler syllables, the ums and the ers and the all right, that kind of stuff. Just like that. So I wanted to apologize for that if it bothers you at all. I do try to go just through my notes, but if something comes into my head, then I run with it. So there's often times where I'm trying to find my place in my notes, and there's the ums and the uhs that kind of come out there. So bear with me. I'll try to switch that around so I'm a little bit more concise, but also articulating my points of view and my insights on the things that I'm sharing with you guys. So without further ado, we're going to talk about the dress rehearsals for the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And the reason that I'm looking at just the first 4 seals is because if you watch part 1, you know that this portion of the tribulation is still going to look like things that have already happened in the past. It's going to be war and famine and plagues. Those are things that have been happening throughout human history. That is something that can be explained in a deluded mind. When things are going crazy during the tribulation, it's still going to look somewhat like the world has looked for the last 2,000 years. So you'll have people that are going to be saying these things are just part of the normal course of human history. And so we look through human history and we want to see, are there any times that it's been worldwide war and worldwide famine and worldwide plague, as well as animals attacking people, that's happened all at the same time? There's some overlap with some of the stuff, but never has it been where you've had the entire world experiencing these things one after the other. So that's what I'm going to show with a little bit of notes here. Right? So the first horseman, though, is the Antichrist. That is the person who comes on the scene and is going to be ushering in this era of world peace. Although it's a false peace, he deceives people. He uses diplomacy and lies and things of that nature in order to conquer the world through that promise of peace. All right. All right, so we want to talk about the spirit of Antichrist, because there isn't really a specific person that you can point to and say that person is the Antichrist. In fact, we won't know who it is because we are part of the restrainer who is going to be removed in order that the man of lawlessness can be revealed. And I'll get to that in a little bit, but this is what John says in 1 John 4, verses 2 through 3. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. So even when John wrote 1 John, which was before he wrote Revelation, he was telling the church that the spirit of Antichrist was already in the world. And that has been true throughout all of history, because the spirit of Antichrist is essentially anything that goes against Christ. All right. The next thing I want to highlight is the mystery of lawlessness that Paul talks about. And he says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, that the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but the lawless one will not be revealed until the restrainer, which is the Holy Spirit indwelling the church, is removed, right? So the rapture will happen, and then at that point, the lawless one, the Antichrist, will be revealed. Now, there have been people in the past who have been kind of like a trial run for the Antichrist. Hitler is a good example of someone that I think even Nostradamus had a prophecy about Hitler that kind of lined up with the things that Hitler did during World War II. There's also been other, not quite leaders, but conquerors who have been throughout history. And we'll talk about them as we get to the wars section of this, that people have speculated this person might be the Antichrist. And there's been a lot of speculation in the last 15 or 20 years of certain political figures, especially in the United States. For some reason, people seem to think that the United States is going to be important in the next few years. We're starting to see more and more now that that's probably not the case. But there's been speculation about political figures who might be the Antichrist. And I was talking with a friend of mine, his name's Sean. This was probably 5 or 6 months ago, about, he was saying, you know, when things were really heated with Russia and Ukraine. Yes, that might be more than 6 months ago. But he was looking at Vladimir Putin as being a potential Antichrist. And I said, no, it's actually more likely that Volodymyr Zelensky is more of a picture of the Antichrist, because he's somebody who's asking for a resolution to this battle. He's asking for peace, and now he's asking for more money and more munitions and stuff. But the picture of the Antichrist is someone who conquers through peace, not through war. It's going to be someone who will not be a big deal prior to the rapture of the church. After the rapture of the church, he will be suddenly this person who has all of the solutions. He'll be pushed forward by the world to become that leader, reluctantly, apparently, but he will be the Antichrist, right? Anyway, there's fruits of the spirit of Antichrist that John lists in 1 John, and some of those are denying that Jesus was fully man and fully God. If anybody preaches a message or a gospel that does not acknowledge the deity of Jesus as well as the full humanhood of Jesus, then that is an Antichrist spirit. There are certain religions, for lack of a better word, that say things like Jesus wasn't actually human. The Gnostics of the early church age said that he only appeared to be human. And that's one of the reasons that when after he was resurrected and he mingled with the disciples and he said, you know, look at my hands, you see the holes in my hands, you know, touch my side. He wanted them to physically touch him because it was a way for them to know that he wasn't a spirit. He was a human being with flesh before and after his death and resurrection. That was something that was very important for them to understand because of the message of the Gnostics saying that he was potentially just a spirit man. He wasn't actually a man. He was fully a man and God, right? They also deny the death, burial, and resurrection in any part or in whole of Jesus. If anybody says, oh, he was exhausted, he passed out, they took him down, and then the disciples went to, you know, rob the tomb. Anything along that line is going to be an Antichrist message. Anybody that preaches a salvation based on works or money is going to be an Antichrist spirit. And anybody who has the love of the world in their message. That's very, very gray area there when you get into things like the prosperity gospel, where certain leaders, I hate to call them that, but certain leaders of groups say, you know, give until it hurts and make sure that I have my $5 million home and my 20 different cars and I'm living a life of luxury and God will bless you. All right. That whole method of preaching and teaching people conditioning people is an antichrist message. Prosperity gospel is one of the worst things to happen to Christianity in the last 50 years. All right. So, as Paul says there in 2 Thessalonians, these things have been around the entire time. The spirit, the mystery of lawlessness is already there. It's not that the lawless one is around yet, but the spirit of lawlessness is already around. All right. The Antichrist will arrive to fill the void that's left by the removal of the restrainer, which is the church, the Holy Spirit-filled church. All right. So that's the first horseman, right? That covers all of time. It's more of a spiritual realm situation. You can't point to specific historical information to show that this has been a dress rehearsal for the Antichrist. The spirit is already in the world, and it has been, and it will be. It's just going to be personified in the Antichrist at that time. So the second seal, the second horseman, is the red horse, the war or anti-peace horse. Throughout history, there has been war. Obviously, there's been war. It's nothing new. The wars of the magnitude that are described in Revelation, however, are less common. That doesn't mean that they haven't existed. It's just that they're few and far between. There's several large-scale wars in history that have been thought of as contenders for that red horseman. There's specifically 3 of them I want to go through. They were great, but they were still only dress rehearsals for that red horseman. All right. So these wars include the Napoleonic Wars, all the way back to 1801 and lasting until 1815, which is when Napoleon, basically almost a nobody, and with a smaller army than the places that he was fighting against, strategically overcame a large portion of the modern world at that time. Now, he only conquered 2 or 3% of the overall landmass, but this was a large percentage of the developed world at that time. And it's important to understand that as the world has become more and more developed, these scales of these wars also increases until you get to the point where very soon during the tribulation, the scale of the wars that will happen from that second horseman will be of a magnitude much greater than these that I'm going to be describing here, right? So the Napoleonic Wars also, because of the amount of time that they covered, included several other Russo-Persian and Russo-Median wars that were going on within the realm, right? Excuse me. This also marked the beginning of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire stretched for a very long period of time. And this being in the early 1800s, the completion of the fall of the Ottoman Empire did not occur until World War I, which is the next war that we're going to talk about. But there were so many battles in and around the different regions of the Ottoman Empire at this time that it began to weaken their structure. And you see, if you look at history, you see more and more of that impact as you get closer and closer to World War I, where the Ottoman Empire is having many different skirmishes around with revolts and rebellions that are happening. Right? The Napoleonic Wars included almost 30 nations in a coalition against Napoleon, and he had roughly 20 allies on his side. And those powers kind of shifted as the wars went on, but essentially this was the true First World War, because you had, like I said, all of the developed nations were involved in this war. And even though at the same time you had the United States having been formed at that time, they were dealing with the War of 1812 and things on their own end around that same period of time. So we, as Americans, don't hear a lot about the European history that was going on there, but that was the more developed area of the world at that time. And this war that was happening was affecting all of those developed areas. All in all, there were over 6 million deaths during that period of time, during those wars, and that's a combination of military and civilian deaths. All of the death tolls that I'll give, I'll break them down if I can, but for the most part, it's a combination of military deaths, like battle deaths, and civilian deaths as a result of the battles. All right. Then we go straight to 1914, which is when World War I officially started, and that lasted about 4.5 years. It was from 1914 until 1918, and I want to jump back. The world population during the time of the Napoleonic Wars was between 950 million and 1 billion. So obviously much less than what it is now, but the 6 million deaths that occurred as a result of that war was a significant percentage of the world's population from that time. In 1914, when World War I starts, you have a population of 1.8 billion in the world, almost twice as much as it was 100 years before. All right. So, and again, like I said before, leading up to World War I, there was a lot of skirmishes, revolts, and mini battles that were happening within the Ottoman Empire. This, again, marks the official fall of the Ottoman Empire by the end of World War I. Now, there were roughly 20 allied nations against Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, Bulgaria, and a few others. But the majority of this war was fought against the Ottoman Empire and its allies. With over 17 million people dead as a result of World War I. And again, that's military and civilian casualties. And this also led straight into the Russian Civil War, which lasted another 4 years beyond that. And another 10 million people died as a result of the Russian Civil War. So you have the Ottoman Empire, which is around Turkey. That's Eastern Europe area. And then you have the Russian civil wars that were happening after that. And the total, so you're looking at 25, almost 30 million people died from 1914 to 1923 as a result of World War I and the Russian civil wars afterwards. Now we go forward to World War II, which started in 1939 and it lasted until 1945. There was 2.3 billion people in the world at the beginning of the war, and it included all of the great powers throughout the world. And what they mean by great powers is pretty much everyone with any sort of international clout. Like if you have trade treaties or any sort of just real strength economically and militarily to not be a second or third world country, they were all involved in World War II. There was 25 million military deaths and 50 million civilian deaths. Those are estimates. So between 75 and 80 million people died as a result of World War II. Now, the reason I separated the military and civilian deaths there is because a large portion of the civilian deaths were a result of policies implemented by certain countries during that period of time. And we're going to get to the impact of policies in a little bit later on in this video here. All right. There have also been many, many, many other conflicts with large death tolls. But these three, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, and World War II, are the wars which involve the majority of the modern worlds and their respective times. So again, just to recap there, the Napoleonic Wars, a little bit under 1 billion people and 6 million deaths. So that's 0.6% of the world population died as a result of the 14 years of the Napoleonic Wars. World War I, the world population was about 1.8 billion and roughly 25 million people died. And that is about 1.5% of the world population. Then with World War II, you have 2.3 billion people in the world with about 80 million people dying. And that's 3.4, 3.5% of the world's population died as a direct result of World War II. So these were all big wars they are the dress rehearsals for the wars that will happen during the tribulation. All right. The next horse is the black horse. That's famine. And his dress rehearsals, he's had plenty of dress rehearsals throughout history. There's been almost as many famines as wars in history, and many times they are somewhat localized. And if they're during relative peace, they can be dealt with through neighboring countries or allied countries helping supply food. A lot of times, if it's just like a weather-related incident like drought or flood or even volcanic eruptions, there's not a war that's tied to that. So you might have allies that can help feed your people so you don't have as bad of a famine, right? There's 10 that stand out that I was looking through the history of all famines that I could find. There's 10 that stood out. That's based on the severity of the famines, if they were close to a war, or if they were close to any sort of plagues or pestilences. All right. So we go all the way back to 400 AD, all the way from 400 AD to 800 AD. It's a large period of time that essentially is highlighting the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire was divided into the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Western Empire fell first and more violently than the Eastern Empire did. But the fall of the Roman Empire, I could probably do a history lesson just on that process all by itself. There are a lot of factors that resulted in that fall. They range from political factors, military factors, famine, and plague, as well as just overall policy issues. One highlight that I did see was that the population of Rome, the capital city, the city of Rome, fell by over 90% from 400 AD to 800 AD. And this is mainly attributed to famine and plague. And I looked it up, and there was actually a plague called the Plague of Justinian from 541 to 549 AD. And this was essentially from the same bacteria that caused the bubonic plague, the Black Death, in the 1300s. This killed about 20% of the population in the capital city, and it was tied to the famines and the political issues and the immigration issues that they were having at that time. All of this stuff made it worse. All right. Now we're going to jump all the way from 800 AD to 1601. All right. The Russian famine is what it's called. Roughly 2 million people died, which was 30% of their population at that time. Now, this one in particular resulted from a volcanic winter, which was actually, there was I think it was in Peru, there was a volcano that erupted, and there was worldwide record cold temperatures for several years, and lots of crops were lost as a result of it. It just more greatly affected the Russian area because of their naturally colder climate anyway. And so, as a result of this, the price of grain doubled. Excuse me. The price of grain doubled. Like I said, 2 million people died. That was almost a third of their population. So this was one of the ones that was really severe, but it was caused essentially by a natural event. It wasn't tied to a war. There wasn't any notations of plagues or things like that associated with it. We go ahead a little bit more to 1654. There was what's called the Deluge, which was a Sweden and Russian invasion of Poland. This was a war-tied famine. Basically, a third of Poland's population died. The plunder of the war, basically going in, razing villages, and just taking everything away from them, it left them unable to grow food for several years. And there was also an instance of the plague afterwards. So that's just one that has a hint of all three things tied together, but it was more localized. It was just in Poland. Between the 1690s and the 1710s, there was multiple different famines across Eastern Europe and near Asia. Just to highlight a few of them, 1.5 million French people died, 250,000 or 40% of the population of Eastern Prussia died, 150,000 Swedish people died, a third of Finland died, and 2 million people in India died. And that's all during that 15 or 20 years from the 1693-ish up until about 1711. In addition, from 1708 to 1712, there was a Great Northern War plague outbreak, and this is in the Baltic Sea region. Up to 2/3 of the population was dead in some areas. There's a combination of starvation and plague. There was a lot of women and children who died as a result of this one because many of the men who were of fighting age were away and dying in war instead of dying of starvation and plague. So that's another one that's just a culmination of that entire 15 to 20 year period of time where there was multiple wars, multiple famines in the area around the Baltic Sea. And then you eventually had this plague set in that killed a large percentage of the remaining population. Now we're going to jump all the way to 1770. In India, there was a Great Bengal famine. It affected 30 million people, which is roughly the population of India at that time. There was crop failures in autumn of 1768 and also in the summer of 1769, along with a smallpox epidemic thought to be caused. So basically, during this time, you have a year and a half of crop failures, and then you also have a smallpox plague that comes in. This caused the prices of rice to go up by 6 times, a factor of 6 in that area. And then to top it all off, in 1770, there was a monsoon season that actually came in because they had these droughts, but now they have the monsoon comes in. And while it brought relief to the crop situation, the new wet season created a perfect environment for more diseases and mosquitoes and things like that to grow and be spread. So you have these people who are malnourished because of the year and a half to 2 years of famine. And then once the rain comes in, you have all of these diseases that come in. All right. And overall, you had 7 to 10 million people just in India die as a result of these things, which is between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total population of the entire country. So, again, this is showing how famines and plagues can be tied together. We can see how wars and famines can be tied together. Then we're going to jump forward to 1845, which is when the Irish potato famine started. We had roughly 1 million people die and 1 million people leave from Ireland. And so overall, that's a 20 to 25% decrease in the population of Ireland during that time, from 1845 to 1852. In addition to the famine, there were outbreaks of typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, starvation, dysentery, and scurvy. All of those things tied together, and you had a complete shift in the population as a result of the famine, as well as the United Kingdom's policy decisions tied to the famine, because the blight on the potatoes was not just isolated to Ireland, but the response that the United Kingdom had to Ireland's situation exacerbated or made worse the whole situation with them there. All right. Then we go forward to 1876, the Great Famine. Again, this is in India. There was a drought. That's one factor. But there was also commoditization of grains, where they basically, instead of looking at grain as a food, they looked at it as a tradable resource, like gold or silver would be a commodity, right? Like cotton. Things that you don't need to survive are commodities, but they're important things for you. But if you turn food into a commodity, then you start trading that food with other countries, then you're not left with enough for yourself in a situation like this. That's one of the main factors that blame for the severity of this particular famine. There was 8 million deaths. This is about 15% of the population at that time. And it was also part of a more global famine. China, Brazil, Northern Africa, and many other nations were also affected by this. Their total death toll was between 15 and 20 million just in the 2 years from 1876 to 1878. And this also is tied to another outbreak of plagues, which I'll get to in just a little bit. And then in 1888 to 1892 in Ethiopia, you had 1 million people die, which is a third of their population. You also had a cholera and smallpox and typhus outbreaks. And there was a disease that was infecting their cattle. It was thought that it might have been brought in by different trade routes. Essentially, it killed 90% of their cattle and probably other types of livestock during that time. So not only did you have a grain famine, but you also had a livestock disease and death. In the 1940s, associated with World War II, you had many famines based on the sanctions and blockades that were set up throughout World War II. They were, 2 to 3 years of time frame where import and export was not allowed at certain locations. And as a result, you had a famine that came after the fact in some of these areas. There's too many different countries to list there, but essentially that's tied to the war. World War II, sanctions and blockades lead to famine, right? The last one is in 1959 to 1961, the Great Chinese Famine. Now this one is almost entirely because of policy decisions. It would have been avoidable if they hadn't done the things that they did as a policy that caused the majority of the actual death and famine here. The central government decided to use new and improved methods of farming that actually dramatically diminish the yields. Now you can see similar things to this happening today, and I'll get into that in the next video. But when people who don't know anything about farming and they're intellectuals suddenly decide that they have the best idea for how to make farming better, they usually ends up making things worse. This is the first example of that I can find. They also had quotas for production as part of their communist revolution. Quotas for food and grain production were required of them. And so as a result of those quotas, you had false reportings. And so the false reportings led to, okay, you guys are making enough grain, so I'm going to reassign some of the people who are farmers to be different types of laborers, like iron workers and steel workers instead of farmers. And so that also decreased the actual returns and the harvest that they would have from the crops. On top of that, they had distribution problems. And then the sort of like unintended consequences situation was they had a 4-pest policy that they implemented. They wanted to get rid of mosquitoes, rats, flies, and sparrows. For whatever reason, those things were considered pests by the centralized government, the communist centralized party. So they did everything they could to motivate the people to kill these 4 pests, but they didn't realize that the sparrows were the ones that ate the insects that were eating their crops. So by killing all of these sparrows, they ended up increasing the amount of crop-eating insects in the regions, and again, caused a diminishment of the crop returns. So you have all these factors combining together, and you end up with estimates between 15 and 55 million dead as a result of bad policy decisions regarding farming, right? All of those different factors that can cause famine are going to be combined during the actual third horse. The black horse is going to bring everything to bear. You're going to have bad policy, you're going to have the war, you're going to have natural events. All these things are going to combine, and the famine is going to be substantially worse than any of these were. At the very least, going to be worse than what people in the world have seen prior to that point. Now we're going to talk about the 4th horseman, the one that is represented by pestilence or plagues, even though if you watched my last video, the 4th horseman is Thanatos, the embodiment of death, that is the culmination of all of the events that have happened as a result of the wars and the famines, and now malnourishment and health issues. All of this stuff is coming together with the 4th horseman. In the past, you've had, and I'm just going through based on the amount of death caused by these different plagues rather than chronologically. The Black Death in Europe was from 1346 to 1353. There was estimates are between 75 and 200 million dead at that time. And the estimates for the overall population of the world at that time was around 500 million. So this is, if we average out the estimate range for the total numbers of death, is about a third of the population of the entire world died during these 7-8 years of the Black Death. The Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920, which you'll remember World War I ended in 1918. So we have 25 to 50 million total dead, which is about 1.5 to 3% of the world population. There was over 500 million people infected. They didn't die, but infected, which is about a third of the population. And the reason that the Spanish flu was so significant and mortal is because most respiratory viruses affect people with less robust immune systems more strongly, the elderly, the infants. But this one was one of the first ones that had what's called a cytokine storm, which you might remember from COVID-19. The cytokine storm is an immune response. The stronger your immune system is, the more of that response it will have. And so the Spanish flu actually was more adept at killing people who were young adults, you know, between, let's say, 16 to 35 years of age. Those people had the most robust immune system and therefore the strongest response. So if they had any sort of, we would say now, comorbidities, if they had any sort of other health issues, they would have been more likely for them to be affected by this. Because they have the strong immune system, they would have been the ones that were most likely to die. And that's not usually the case with the respiratory virus. So the amount of dead from the Spanish flu was not only significant as a raw number, but the types of people that it killed was also very significant. All right. Again, this was a part of the aftermath of World War I, and with the other things that we've already seen associated with war, you have a more conducive environment for the spread and the growth of these types of diseases. So it was just kind of that sweet spot there where you had the world being ravaged by a war and then various different areas of possibly famine. And now you have the diseases that come in. So I would say World War I, that era, was one of the closest shadows of what we might be looking at during the tribulation period. All right. The next one I want to talk about is COVID-19. It was 2019, I believe, October or November of 2019 are the official first cases. And it's still going on now, technically. The estimates on the deaths are between 7 and 29 million. There's a lot of controversy on that as far as people dying with COVID versus people dying of COVID. I don't want to get into that, but there was also comorbidities, things that make people more likely to die in general. I'm not going to get too deep into that. The COVID-19 was just another example of something that was, especially recently, something that spread throughout the entire world and could potentially have been a dress rehearsal for the pale green horse. That's all. Then in 1855 all the way through 1960, we have what was called the Third Plague, which again is the bubonic plague, a different variant of it. This mostly was isolated to India and China during different shifts of power and associated with the famines. There was roughly 12 to 15 million people that died in total from that. And then again, after World War I, between 1918 and 1922, you had about 2 to 3 million people die in Russia from typhus. This is also coinciding with the Russian Civil War that we covered before. Now, there were many other different plagues and outbreaks and things that were highlighted in the list that I was looking at. Some of the most common diseases that people were getting from these different things that actually had significant death rates were cholera, the bubonic plague, typhus, influenza, and smallpox. Now, smallpox has technically been eradicated, but stranger things have happened. So you may see something that's similar to these diseases that would be part of the diseases that come out during that latter stage of the fourth seal being open. I just want to go through real quick some of the death rates for these diseases. Smallpox has a 30% mortality rate. The bubonic plague has a 10% mortality rate with treatment and a 30 to 90% mortality rate with no treatment. Typhus, cholera, and influenza are all treatable in different ways. But typhus with no treatment has a 10 to 60% mortality rate. Cholera has a 50 to 60% mortality rate. And influenza varies by the type. There's so many different types now. But roughly 300,000 to 600,000 people die every year from influenza. A lot of those are in lesser developed areas. So, just to bring it all together, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the four seals, the first four seals that get open, have had plenty of practice and preparation for the big show that's going to be happening. When they are officially unleashed, with the opening of those first four seals, the Antichrist will rise to power through a great deception and offer of world peace. The wars that will soon follow that will be an exponential run-up, similar to what you saw with the Ottoman Empire before World War I. You'll have skirmishes, you'll have violence throughout the world. Again, this is the Red Horse takes away peace of mind from people. So you'll have violence everywhere, and you'll have wars start to erupt. This is ultimately going to lead to a greater loss of life than even World War II. The ensuing famine afterwards will be the result of not only climate issues and natural disasters, but also the byproducts of the wars that ensue. Those three factors will contribute equally to the famine. And then finally, the conditions created by the war and the famine will be ripe for the growth and spread of diseases. And this progression of events will culminate with the death of a fourth of the world's population from the wars, the famines, the plagues, as well as wild beasts. It will appear to just be another in a long chain of historical events caused by humans, to show a tendency that they do tend to happen close together. It's going to look logical. It's going to be bad. It's going to be way worse than anything in history, but it's going to look logical as far as the things that cause these things to happen. All right? So real quick, I want to read a little bit from 2 Peter. This is 2 Peter verses 3 through 9. All right? And Peter says, "Most importantly, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. Where is the promise of his coming, they will ask. Ever since our fathers fell asleep, everything continues as it has from the beginning of creation. But they deliberately overlook the fact that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time perished in the flood." So this is Peter's talking about God's patterns, right? "And by the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men." That's talking about the tribulation to come. "Beloved, do not let the one thing escape your notice. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is slow in keeping it. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness, but he is patient with you. He's not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." So even during the tribulation, God is still going to be extending that last chance at salvation until the full implementation of the beast system and the beginning of the bowl judgments. So everything, if you watch my last video, everything up until the beginning of the bowl judgments, that's through the first four seals, the fifth seal's happening in the background with the altar, the first four trumpet judgments are a taste of what's to come with the bowl judgments. Even all the way through that, God is still going to be giving people a chance to make a choice, to repent, to realize that Jesus is their salvation. They can choose between Jesus and the Antichrist. At that point, God gives them all of this evidence of his truth, of the gospel of Jesus, and they will make that choice. Once they make that choice, everyone in the world will make that choice, one way or the other. Once they make that choice, there's no more. It's all going to get wiped out. And that's what they have. So much time leading up to that point to make that decision. God gives them that chance. He is long-suffering. He is not slow as we understand slowness. He's not willing that any should perish, and he does everything he can until finally people make their decision. And once they make their decision, it's over. All right? So, again, because of all of this stuff, many people during the tribulation, even during the tribulation, after the rapture, they'll have an explanation for that. Probably aliens, but they'll have an explanation for that. There's going to be many people still in denial of the fact that they are, in fact, in the tribulation. At the same time, they're going to be demanding that the Antichrist fix everything. And that fix is going to be the system of the beast. That's going to be what's coming up next. Right? It's going to be in its infancy at that point. It's in its infancy now, to be honest with you. My next video is going to be about that. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the system of the beast, leading to the mark of the beast, and the pledge and worship of the beast, that's all what this is building up to. All right? With those first 4 trumpets, like I said, once those first 4 trumpets are done, that's when it's going to be turned on. And that's when the false prophet is going to basically say, you got to take the mark. The only way we're going to take care of this is for everybody to be in part of the system, everybody to be on the same page. You got to take the mark. All right? And so, in my next video, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about the beast system. We're going to be talking about how where we are right now is easily 3.5 years from now until the beast system is fully implemented. We're not that far away from it. And if we know that the beast system doesn't get implemented fully until the 3.5 year mark of the tribulation, and we aren't in the tribulation right now, it means that there's at least 3.5 years for to go from where we are right now to get to here. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. It's the one I'm most excited about because it pertains to today. I wanted to do the first video covering all of the stuff that's going to happen in the tribulation. I wanted to do this video to show how things have gotten more and more ramped up to where they are now. And so with the next video, I'm going to look at where we are right now and how that looks going forward. I'll see you guys soon. Have a great day. Maranatha.